Hey, New Testament Bible read-along readers, welcome to week 9. We are coming to the end of the second month and the beginning of the third month in this program, so congratulations on the progress that you're making. Now, in this section, this week's readings from the Gospel of Mark, we're going to be hearing and reading passages that show us the really deep contrast between Jesus' faithfulness and his disciples' repeated faithlessness. This is where, as well, we're going to see Jesus going deliberately to the cross and speaking to his disciples explicitly about that. Though, well, we'll see how that turns out. We've already had a hint of that in Matthew, haven't we? We've seen it once. So you're going to be reading again about the feeding of the 5,000, and you're going to see again how the disciples fail on this episode. But Jesus does a miracle which reminds us of the way that God gave Israel manna in the wilderness back during the Exodus. We'll see Jesus still another storm. And again, the disciples will be faithless, but Jesus will deliver them with power that could belong only to God. If you read the 107th Psalm, okay, you're going to see how that says only God could still a storm like this. We'll see how Jesus will address the tradition that the Pharisees have of hand washing. This wasn't a matter of hygiene, but of ritual purity. And Jesus is going to emphasize real purity isn't about what happens on the outside, but what comes from within. And in this respect, he's going to be critiquing the religious leaders who are rejecting him and reminding his disciples of where their discipleship really has to begin. We'll see a Syrophoenician woman, a woman who doesn't even belong to Israel, whose faith is so great she's willing to take the role of a dog who just sits under the table waiting for the children to drop crumbs on the table. She knows crumbs from Jesus will be enough. And Jesus honors her faith supremely and says, this is greater than I've seen in all of Israel. There's going to be a man who is deaf and mute. And this is interesting because it's one of the only a couple of stories that is only found in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is going to put his hands in his ears and on his tongue, and he's going to say, be opened. And this is like an object lesson to the disciples. Your ears need to be opened so you can speak clearly about me. You're not hearing what I'm doing. You're not understanding what I'm doing. After feeding the 5,000, Jesus is going to feed the 4,000 with the same significance and with the same repeated failure of the disciples. They've had the quiz twice. They failed it both times. Jesus will discuss those who demand that he do a sign, and he'll say, I'm not doing a sign for you. But it's amazing because he's doing signs all over the place. It's just, again, a matter of seeing what's there. And then there's a kind of a crucial point. Jesus will be in a boat with the disciples. And we think, every time we've been in a boat, the disciples have failed. And he'll say, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And we realize, man, bread has been a huge problem with these guys. Every time, give them bread, they fail to do it. And again, the disciples are going to misunderstand. They'll say, duh, he said that because we don't have any bread. And Jesus will say, guys, do you remember what happened before? So their faithlessness is really there on display. Then there's going to be a blind man, a second story that's found only in Mark, very interesting. And Jesus is going to lay hands on him and say, what do you see? And he'll say, I see men, but they look like trees. It's like, wait, did Jesus only partially heal this man? Well, he touches him a second time, and then his sight is restored. It's another acted object lesson where Jesus is saying to his disciples, you're like this guy. You're seeing, but you're not seeing clearly. You need to learn to see clearly. And then, crucial moment, Jesus is going to ask the disciples, who do you say I am? And Peter is going to say, you are God's true king. You are God's Christ, God's Messiah, God's anointed one. Now, there's more that's going to come in the week that follows. You may again remember what happened in Matthew with that. Well, the same thing's going to happen in Mark, and it's very telling. So as you're reading, this section, what does Mark want us to ask ourselves? I think one question is, am I like the religious leaders? Have I imbibed the yeast of the scribes or the Pharisees and of Herod? Will I not see what God has done in Jesus, even though it's right in front of me? Or am I like the disciples? I see partly, but I get complacent and self-satisfied, and I don't really trust Jesus? Or am I like the weak people in the story? Am I like the Syrophoenician woman? I understand I may be insignificant, but still, anything that I receive from Jesus, that's going to be enough. I need only what Jesus alone can give. Well, happy reading, and glad you're making progress through the text.